Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 27th of January, and in today's video we're primarily focusing on Maryinka, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and Kupiansk fronts. We're going to begin by looking at what's going on around Maryinka, just to the north of the town. If you remember, in early January we talked about the Russian advances that occurred around the trenches, tree lines, fields, and in particular the agricultural facility that was being used as a Ukrainian defensive node. And so now we have further confirmation based on deep state reporting from last week of a minor positional advance located within this open field. And then looking at Bilohorivka quickly, there are no new concrete pieces of evidence to indicate an advance. The Russian forces continue to be stationed in the easternmost part of the village around the Orthodox Church, while the Ukrainians have formed a solid defense line to the north and to the south of the fishing pond in some very narrow streets that make up this entire village. But this is also indicative of this part of the front line not being the number one priority for the Russian attacks. Meanwhile, the Russians do still continue to output a lot of firepower in this direction. We have a video that was recently released showing the TOS-1A shelling of Ukrainian forward positions in Bilohorivka. And what's becoming now the norm in this section of the village is that it's looking more and more like the remnants of Maryinka, as in a lot of these houses are getting destroyed. But for the most part, a lot of these houses do still have their skeletons, and so you do have a lot of Ukrainian troops defending in this direction within those houses, using that as their base for forward operations. And so those areas being struck by Russian shelling and also by drones. There's a lot of FPV drone footage from this particular village of the sort of Platov units striking individual troop clusters. And just as a quick reminder, the 46th Air Assault Brigade is now another brigade that has been sent in this direction to defend against the Russian assaults in the general Maryinka area. So here you have their logo, and pretty interestingly, you also have this Russian unit that was moved in from the Zaporozhye front, the 69th Covering Brigade, which is apparently some border patrol unit from eastern Russia. They served really throughout the entire southern counteroffensive that Ukraine launched in the summer, defending in that direction, while you had the 46th attacking. So now we have proof of this unit being moved from Zaporozhye to the Donetsk fronts. We're now seeing them and some of their vehicles engaging in frontline combat just to the east of Ivanivske, where there has also been a gradual Russian increase in pressure over the past 2 weeks or so. And so there was one of their BMP-1s that was recorded by Ukrainian drones that got destroyed. And so you do still have some of these Russian forces with BMPs and BMDs dismounting infantry. So you have individual infantry fighting vehicles are doing that dismounting infantry in some of the open fields and tree lines located east of Novelska, and in efforts to gradually knock out the Ukrainians from some of their most fortified positions in this area. That is taking a very, very long time, as Novelska is one of Ukraine's strongest defensive nodes on a local level in this region. And speaking of this region, we also have an update from Prvomaiske from today of the Russian forces getting full control over the southernmost district of the village, which includes all of the dachas that are just to the west of this particular reservoir over here. And so the Russian forces fully cleared out that area, with the Ukrainians withdrawing several hundred meters north onto this particular road, which is the main road that runs through the central part of Prvomaiske, where there is still Ukrainian defense preventing further Russian advances. But this is the most recent Russian advance through that village. And now we're going to look at the clarification of what's going on around Avdiivka. So in early January, the Russian forces started organizing for an assault on the Ukrainian southern strongholds in Avdiivka under the cover of the foggy weather conditions in the area. And then they actually launched that attack on January 18th. That's when the Russians actually succeeded in breaking through some of Ukraine's most heavily fortified areas across the entire front. But in this case, it was in the defensive areas south of Avdiivka. So if you remember, you'll see that a lot of them are just to the west of Avdiivka's industrial zone. A lot of them were also to the north of the Donetsk Ring Road. And so you had this pretty solid line of defense that was manned by some battalions from the 110th Mechanized Brigade. So starting on the 24th of January, we began to receive reports And this is actually ubiquitous as it's coming from both the Ukrainian and Russian side, but they both reported that the way in which this assault was really galvanized and the initial spearhead was launched by Russian forces that were able to infiltrate the Ukrainian rear using an old sewage pipe, and that was used to actually enter into the Sartskaya Halt area, which was a lodging position for the Ukrainians and also included some trenches to the north of it. And so what happened was the Russian forces had control over the industrial zone, of course, for several months. In a direction, they likely found an abandoned reservoir located probably over here. This is the general location as pointed out by deep states. And so you had the Russian sappers in this direction, especially during the past few weeks when there was foggy weather conditions, which made it harder for Ukrainian drone reconnaissance to spot these sappers operating. They were able to create these passages and create holes into the sewage area. And then you had those scouts also clearing out the sewage area to the best of their ability to make it more conducive for a significant amount of Russian forces to pass by. And so when you compare the distances from this area, it is above 2 kilometers of going underground through this old sunken sewage pipe. But that is actually what the Russian forces did on the night of the 17th. And they had about 150 men that were involved in that operation that entered underground through several paths. Now, it actually took several attempts for the Russian garrison to end up successfully reaching their destination because there were reports of an insufficient oxygen supply underground. And what's interesting is that this entire pipeline was likely meant as a connection between the abandoned reservoir at this point, which doesn't really have any water in it left, but it was probably making its way all the way to the Avdiivka coke plant in that direction. And so it also made its way through this specific fortification, the Tsarskoye Hota fortification, which was really holding the line for the Ukrainians in this region ever since the Russians launched their offensive activity in October. And the Ukrainian garrison was caught off guard. Most of them were either killed or captured. And in the process of the Russian forces getting their foothold over here, the Ukrainian forces that were completely at ground one, which could be scores or could be dozens, something in that ballpark, that were defending in these trenches over here, they were cut off from the main Ukrainian nodes in southern Avdiivka. And at the same time, the Russian forces utilized the complete surprise that they had taken the Ukrainians by to further launch attacks along this particular road into the residential quarter of Avdiivka and also through the forested areas. And so that was a period of panic. It's a period where the Ukrainian 110th Mechanized Brigade had to send in reinforcements. Some of those reinforcements may have actually been moved in from the northern flank of Avdiivka, which reduced the presence over there for them. But it was necessary, and they moved in what is imagined to be about 1 battalion of men to counterattack in this direction. And so that Ukrainian counterattack, you could say that it lasted several days following the 18th, and they were able to initially push back the Russians from their furthest extent of advances, because the furthest Russian extent of advances was around the entire residential quarter that I've marked in red over here. They were able to get full control over it for a brief moment in time, and then you had the eventual counterattack by the 110th Mechanized Brigade, which really started in full force on the 21st of January. And that's also the time where you had support for the 110th, which is something that they really never received previously. The 110th has been really defending on its own on Avdiivka's southern outskirts for a very long time now with minimal support, but they ended up getting support this time from the Korn Group and from the 116th Mechanized Brigade as a whole. If you recall, it's a unit that was serving in the southern counteroffensive. So they moved in their tanks on the 21st of January, and this was filmed by the Korn Group along these main streets, reasserted control in some of these areas, or at least made them into a gray zone, and fired onto Russian positions. By this point, over those past 5 days of fighting, from the 18th to the 23rd, the Ukrainians were able to push back the Russians from about half of this residential quarter. But since then, the Russian forces have been able to stabilize the line and maintain their foothold in this easternmost parts of this residential quarter. And during the same period of time, they've also started to consolidate their gains that they made as a result of the pipeline breaking through the rear. And so it did take a lot of time. You can imagine a week to go through individually, clear out every single trench, to get control of the Ukrainians that had been killed in the fighting, taking the POWs. There's probably scores of Ukrainian forces that were just scattered across this area that had to be cleared out, and that also includes within the forested areas. So that was a gradual process that's been really taking up all the time that I haven't been uploading videos in. And that's just to give you guys an idea of what's going on. The Russian sources like Rybar, they now claim that the forested area has been fully cleared out, which would include this area over here now being under Russian control. So we will wait to see if those reports are actually correct. Now, another area where there are a lot of reports circulating, but not a lot of videos to back them up, is in the area to the southeast of Ivanivske. I was talking about this, I think, 2 videos ago, and for good reason, because there were videos released on the 20th of January by the Ukrainian side showing some of Russia's infantry squads and tanks withdrawing back to their front line following an attempted attack in these fields that are actually located just to the northwest of Klishivka and of the height 215.7 the Russian forces have been trying to fully take over for over a month now. And so in recent days, there's been reports circulating from the Russian information space of a successful advance in the fields to the southeast of Ivanivske, which would include this area over here that I'm going over in red. And actually, Rybar had a very maximalist point of view in terms of their mapping, which showed all of this section over here also under Russian control, which would include this entirety of this tree line over here, which definitely includes defensive fortifications such as dugouts right on the outskirts of the village itself, which is right now one of Ukraine's strongest defensive nodes on the eastern side of the Donetsk pipeline, or sorry, water canal. But in any case, this area is important because this area that I'm shading in red is located on a high ground, and not just that area, but also generally the entire area to the south of Ivanivske, all those fields under Ukrainian control. They are on heights that overlook the valley on which Ivanivske and the T0504 road that the Ukrainians are using for supplies lies upon. And so the Russians definitely have a vested interest in getting control of those heights, not only to overlook Klishivka and get better control over the trenches over here, but also in order to directly fire upon Ivanivske. Now, so far, there isn't enough information to verify a full Russian control over this area in particular, where there were mentions of a Russian advance. But in the same area, there was a video released by Ukraine's 5th Assault Brigade, which is now one of the units defending in this region. They were also defending on Bakhmut's outskirts directly to the east of Ivanivske. They released a high-resolution video on the 19th of January showing their drones dropping grenades onto some pretty small Russian infantry groupings that were advancing through these snowy fields around here. Some of them actually made it into trenches and then were struck by the drones, leading to some casualties. And that's really the geolocation that confirms there is Russian activity in this region, but there isn't enough video evidence to indicate that there has been a significant advance. So we're going to have to wait and see about that. Now, looking at Bilohorivka, we've also mentioned this recently. The Russian forces have been advancing over here in positional fighting for over a week and a half now. They started off by getting control over additional trenches and open fields just to the east of the village. And this area is extremely important. It is located on a local hill overlooking Bilohorivka, which is on a valley. It's very difficult to defend in that regard. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians have held the eastern line. At the same time, the Russian forces had success in taking over the filtration plant just to the north of the village. And at the same time, you have the Ukrainian, actually 81st Air Mobile Brigade defending in this direction, with them releasing recently several of these FPV drone strike videos on the Russian forces. Again, this is one of the lower priority parts of the front line, but recently we've seen an uptick in Russian advances in this region, slowly chipping away at the outskirts of the village. And lastly, on the Kupiansk front, we do have some new news that broke today, actually, which is being reported on the Russian Telegram space by several sources, which is why I've not adjusted the map yet, because there's no geolocation to verify it. But they're reporting that the 47th Guards Tank Division, which is associated with the 1st Tank Army, they attacked from their newly acquired positions in Krokhmalne, which was actually captured by the Russian forces several days ago. That was used as a forward operating base to actually go and take over Tabaivka. Now, I'm not sure if that's true, but there were some sources that also said that the village of Kotlyarivka was captured. We're gonna have to wait and see if this accusation itself is verifiable, because that would actually be a significant gain for the Russian forces. And so, regardless of whether it's true or not, I do want to quickly focus on the sector, because the Russian forces definitely have increased pressure over now a week, and this does have some implications for the local front line. If you remember in my last video, I talked about how the line over here is located on the valley. So the village of Pischane, Tabaivka, those are in valleys. Taking them over directly doesn't give much of an advantage to the Russian forces. But the area just to the north of Tabaivka, taking that over would actually have a significance. For instance, taking over this road over here leading directly into eastern Kupiansk would be significant, as it would give the Russian forces a vector of attack and their armored formations a vector to reach the Ukrainian main node east of the Oskil River in Kupiansk. But then also looking at an area like Kotlyarivka, it is located on a ridge. So these are high ground positions around Kotlyarivka, and it would give the Russian forces a sort of foothold within this four-town cluster that the Ukrainians are relying upon to hold their current front line on the Kupiansk front in general. As you can see, these are the four main vanguard villages, and once you have you go past these villages, you really have just open fields for 10 kilometers before reaching the next Ukrainian defensive lines that have been built up in villages just near the Oskil River itself. And so that's why the Ukrainians have poured in resources over here. It's why they've been able to repel attacks from the Russian forces from Yahidne, for instance, where they launch attacks onto Ivanivska in previous months. And so it does make sense why the Russian forces would try to open up a new vector of attack to the south of this village cluster, and then potentially try to attack from the north towards Kotlyarivka to gain a foothold over there. But we have to wait and see to verify if that actually happened. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.